How can the deaths of Palestinians in Gaza be monitored by outside organisations? More than 18,700 people have been killed in 10 weeks. The figures are coming from health authorities under the control of Hamas in Gaza. The credibility of statistics undermined by sceptical world leaders, including President Biden, who said he would question those figures early on in the conflict. Well, for today's perspective, we can speak to Emily Tripp from the UK-based not-for-profit transparency watchdog Airwars. It's an open source organisation that uses data to try to corroborate, for example, at the moment, the death toll in Gaza. Let's bring in Emily. Your organisation has been going now for a decade, looking at several conflict zones. Tell us about the work that's going on in Gaza right now.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, firstly. I mean, what we're seeing in Gaza is on a scale that we haven't seen ever. And we've monitored, as you said, for more than a decade. We've monitored conflicts over the past 20 years, including the war against ISIS. What we're seeing now, I mean, we're an organization that looks particularly at every single harm allegation, and we try and document every single one. And then we preserve digitally all of the information that comes out for each case. And as I said, I mean, what we've seen, we've now got more than 1,700 individual allegations. Each one of those will have dozens potentially of casualties attached.
I mean, the sheer amount we're talking about, Emily, another 90 overnight reported after another strike at the Jabalia camp. Just give us an insight in terms of the incredibly difficult work you're trying to do, given the lack of access to international organisations, a sense of how your open source work is carried out, and where you are at the moment in terms of those figures that Hamas-run health authorities are saying, these, nearly 20,000.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I think it's important to note that even when international organizations don't have access, local civilians and local citizens often are documenting the world around them in a very comprehensive way. And that's what our organization does. We listen to those local voices. Particularly in Gaza, we're seeing most of our sources actually are coming from relatives of victims who've been killed. So that may be, loved ones who they've lost in a strike, or it could be friends, it could be relatives. And so I think that's the information environment we're seeing. And I think often the international journalists might come in and kind of be able to legitimize in some way those figures for international audiences. But I think it's really important to remember that there are dozens of local journalists still remaining and doing extremely brave work inside Gaza, documenting the toll.
When it comes to you having a sense of the death toll in Gaza, how long does it usually take before you sense you'll have some kind of credible idea of, the situation up until now? Clearly, this is a continuing conflict.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of a comprehensive death toll, I think it's going to take us a very, very long time as an organization. We've already published more than 100 cases, but I can say from what we're doing, we do have some indicative findings which are corroborating the Ministry of Health death toll. When they released on the 26th of October, the Ministry of Health released a list of names, including IDs of individuals who'd been killed. And part of what we've been doing is matching those individual names with specific incidents of harm. We've already found about 200 children within that list that we've been able to identify two very particular cases and airstrikes where they were killed. So I can say that while it may take us a very long time, each case is extremely complex. Each case is taking a while because families are still kind of buried in the rubble. Being able to identify survivors is becoming increasingly difficult, particularly with information blackouts. But what I can say is that, the numbers and the scale and the kind of the overall estimates that we're seeing from the Ministry of Health are very much consistent with the damage and the number of airstrikes that the Israelis themselves say that they're dropping.
There's an interesting point about your organisation, which also perhaps sets some context on these figures we're seeing now, because in the past, it is worth saying the UN looked at these figures with some credibility from Hamas-run health authorities in Gaza. They looked at the situation from the brief conflict in 2021. You also looked at that data, and your findings were quite similar to the Hamas figures. Is that right?
Yes, indeed. In 2021, we did the same as we're doing now. We documented every single case where a civilian was harmed. And we found that indeed the Ministry of Health data overall was very much consistent, not just with what we were seeing, but also with organizations on the ground like Al-Mazan, who do incredible work documenting kind of, witness testimonies and observations. So yes, I mean, they have historically been consistent. And I think that's something that other organizations, for example, Human Rights Watch, have also supported in the past.
How free do you feel you are to operate? When you look at the situation, Emily, with, for example, another organisation famously using open source material in a slightly different way, Elliot Higgins and Bellingcat, and the threats that they face from Russia, China, for example. How are you coping as an organisation in terms of threats to the work you're doing?
I mean, we're a civilian harm organization first and foremost. We document harm, and the method that we do that is open source investigative techniques. But I think what the biggest threat to our organization, honestly, is kind of scale and resource. We're part of something called the Casualty Recorders Network. There are lots of organizations that do this kind of work. I think the investigative techniques that have been so well now forged by organizations like Bellingcat, by Elliot Higgins, are now really democratizing the ability for people to look at information coming out of very complex environments like war zones and make sense of it. And make sense of it in a way that is understandable for people who perhaps have never experienced these very, very difficult and challenging information zones.
Are your teams amongst those who would like to get access to be in Gaza as soon as possible?
For our team, we stay remote, but we really help those who are trying to get access. So we see ourselves as a starting point. In the war against ISIS, for example, we did a lot of work kind of pinpointing in time and place specific incidents of harm. So as soon as areas like Mosul opened up again, we were able to facilitate, journalists and researchers who could then go and find specific locations or incidents that may otherwise have been kind of lost by the international media.
That's really interesting, just setting out the context of how Airwars is working. Emily, really good to speak to you and good luck with what is incredibly difficult work in Gaza.
Thank you so much.